This morning, the political temperature between the United States and Canada erupted in a way few observers expected, but many strategists had quietly prepared for. The spark came when Donald Trump publicly called out Canada with a series of personal and aggressive attacks. What began as a burst of early morning anger quickly escalated into a high-stakes international confrontation. Trump's accusations were not subtle. Through a rapid chain of social media posts and an unscripted press gaggle on the White House South Lawn, he singled out Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, accusing him of ingratitude and threatening the harshest economic penalties ever directed at what he described as a so-called ally. The language was sharp, emotional, and unmistakably personal. But within hours, the story had transformed. Mark Carney did not respond with outrage, and he certainly did not respond with insults. Instead, he launched a calculated three-layer counter-response that would stun markets, rattle political circles, and reshape the narrative before the trading day even ended. It included a detailed dismantling of Trump's claims using hard economic data, immediate and highly targeted economic countermeasures aimed directly at Trump's political strongholds, and a synchronized wave of endorsements from 5 allied nations that appeared with remarkable speed. By the time the closing bell rang on Wall Street, the financial markets had delivered their own verdict, and the verdict was unmistakable. Carney had won the exchange decisively. But the deeper story here was not merely about tariffs, pipelines, or trade agreements. The real story was about leadership styles revealed under pressure. One leader came armed with emotion and improvisation. The other arrived with preparation, coordination, and a plan already loaded into the system. And when impulse meets preparation in geopolitics, the outcome is rarely a mystery. Think about it for a moment. In any negotiation, whether in business, diplomacy, or military strategy, the side that anticipates the battlefield usually controls the battlefield. Watching the first hours of this confrontation unfold, you could almost hear experienced analysts quietly saying the same thing. Someone here had been waiting for this moment. The sequence actually began earlier that morning. At 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, a pre-recorded interview with Mark Carney aired on Canadian morning television. At first glance, it looked like a routine policy discussion. Carney spoke calmly about Canada's ongoing economic diversification, highlighting newly strengthened trade agreements with the European Union, Japan, and the United Kingdom. He discussed the construction of energy infrastructure along both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts and outlined the strategic partnerships that had quietly reshaped Canada's economic framework over the past 2 years. Nothing about the interview appeared provocative. The tone was measured, professional, and almost academic. Then came a sentence that would ignite the entire chain reaction. Carney stated that Canada's economic future was no longer hostage to the decisions of any single trading partner. He emphasized that Canada had built a resilient, diversified, sovereign economy in less than 2 years. Those words were carefully chosen. Hostage, single trading partner. To economists and policy analysts, the statement was a factual description of Canada's diversification strategy. But to Donald Trump, the message sounded like something else entirely. What he heard was not economic analysis. What he heard was a challenge to American dominance. And the reaction came quickly. At 7:15 a.m., Trump began posting. 6 posts appeared within 45 minutes, and each message grew sharper than the last. The first post labeled Carney the most ungrateful leader of any country and declared that Canada would be nothing without the United States. The second accused Canada of exploiting American generosity for decades. The third escalated dramatically, promising the most severe economic measures ever imposed on an ally. But there was a critical problem. None of those threats included specific policy mechanisms. They were sweeping promises delivered in anger, without operational details. And in international economic warfare, vague threats often trap the person, making them more than the person receiving them. Then came the 4th, 5th, and 6th posts. At that point, the tone shifted from economic dispute to personal attack. Trump criticized Carney's past career at Goldman Sachs, labeled him a globalist banker, questioned his years as governor of the Bank of England, and even suggested that Carney was not truly Canadian. 6 posts, 45 minutes, 0 policy consultation, 0 coordination with advisors, 0 legal review. This was raw impulse transmitted through a phone before most of Washington had even finished breakfast. And here is where seasoned observers began raising an eyebrow. Because every public threat issued by a president creates an expectation of follow-through. Once spoken on the global stage, those words become commitments. But commitments made without preparation can quickly become traps. At exactly 8 a.m., the situation escalated again. Trump paused for cameras on the White House South Lawn before departing for a scheduled event. Standing before reporters, he doubled down on his social media barrage and introduced three specific economic threats. These were not vague promises anymore. These were concrete proposals broadcast live to the world. First, he suggested potential banking restrictions on Canadian financial institutions operating inside the United States. Second, he floated the possibility of freezing American imports of Canadian crude oil. Third, he mentioned initiating withdrawal proceedings from the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. Three threats, all delivered spontaneously. Reports later suggested that some of Trump's own economic advisors were learning about these announcements in real time by watching television. One advisor was reportedly seen stepping away immediately to make urgent phone calls, trying to determine whether the president's statements were even legally possible. At that moment, the strategic trap had already formed, because by issuing precise threats on camera, Trump had boxed himself into a narrow corridor of options. If he backed down later, it could appear weak. If he followed through without analysis, the consequences could be severe. And the most important question in Washington that morning became simple. How would Canada respond? For the next 4 hours, there was silence. Absolute silence. From 8 a.m. until 12:30 p.m., Mark Carney said nothing publicly. Television panels speculated endlessly. Political commentators filled the vacuum with theories. Some argued that Canada was scrambling to prepare a response. Others suggested that Ottawa might be intimidated by the scale of the threats. Trump allies were quick to declare victory. They said Canada was afraid. They said Carney had no answer. But what most people misunderstood was that the silence was not hesitation. It was staging. Inside government channels, something very different was happening. The response package had already been built weeks earlier. Carney's team had prepared multiple counter-strike scenarios designed for exactly this kind of provocation. Those 4.5 hours were not spent inventing a strategy. They were spent activating one. Verification calls were made to allied capitals. Legal teams confirmed that economic measures were ready for execution. Financial analysts synchronized the timing so that Canada's response would arrive after markets had fully absorbed Trump's threats, but before the closing bell. This was not improvisation. This was choreography. And if you listen closely to the rhythm of geopolitical conflicts, you begin to notice a pattern. When one side explodes with emotion and the other side responds with silence, it often means the quieter side already knows exactly what it will do next. At 12:30 p.m., the silence ended. Mark Carney stepped onto the floor of Canada's Parliament and delivered a 15-minute address that would redefine the entire confrontation. And the contrast between the two leaders could not have been more striking. At 12:30 p.m., Mark Carney stepped forward on the floor of Canada's Parliament and began speaking. The tone of his voice was calm, controlled, almost clinical. There was no anger, no raised voice, no theatrical gestures. The contrast with the fiery morning performance from Washington was immediate and unmistakable. Where Trump had shouted, Carney spoke quietly. Where Trump had improvised, Carney read from a prepared document that had clearly passed through multiple layers of economic review, legal scrutiny, and diplomatic coordination. The entire address lasted about 15 minutes, but those 15 minutes carried the weight of weeks of preparation. Carney began by addressing the three threats issued by Trump earlier that morning. One by one, he dismantled them not with rhetoric, but with data so precise that it left little room for counterargument. The first threat concerned potential banking restrictions on Canadian financial institutions operating in the United States. Carney leaned slightly forward at the podium and began explaining a reality that many viewers outside the financial world rarely consider. Canadian financial institutions, he said, collectively hold approximately $2.4 trillion in global assets. Each year they process more than $600 billion in cross-border financial transactions. These banks are not minor participants in the American financial system. They are deeply embedded within it. Canadian banks finance commercial projects across dozens of American states. They participate in mortgage lending pipelines, commercial credit markets, and international transaction clearing systems that move billions of dollars through the American economy every week. Restricting their operations, Carney explained, would not simply punish Canada. It would disrupt American lending networks, slow mortgage approvals, tighten credit markets, and complicate international financial flows that American companies rely on every day. And then came a line delivered so calmly that its quiet confidence carried even more force. Carney suggested that before making such commitments, the president might wish to consult the Federal Reserve, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the very regulators responsible for maintaining American financial stability. It was a polite sentence, but the implication was devastating. Anyone listening carefully understood the message. The threat itself revealed a misunderstanding of how the financial system actually works. At this point, observers in economic circles began recognizing what was happening. This was not a political speech designed to excite supporters. This was a briefing designed to dismantle a narrative piece by piece. And honestly, hearing it unfold, you could almost sense a shift in the atmosphere. Markets, analysts, diplomats, everyone was suddenly leaning closer, realizing this response had been engineered long before the morning's drama. Then Carney moved to the second threat. Trump had suggested freezing American imports of Canadian crude oil. Carney responded not with opinion, but with analysis drawn from 3 independent energy research firms, each cited by name. According to their projections, freezing Canadian crude imports would push American gasoline prices up by roughly $1.4 per gallon within 30 days. The reason was simple. About 60% of all crude oil imported into the United States comes from Canada. More importantly, American refineries, particularly the massive complexes across the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast, were built specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. Their machinery, chemical treatment systems, and refining processes are calibrated for that particular grade of oil. Switching to alternative crude sources is not something a refinery can do overnight. It requires billions of dollars in infrastructure upgrades and years of engineering adjustments. Even if those upgrades began immediately, replacement supplies from alternative sources would take months or years to match the volume currently flowing through Canadian pipelines. Carney paused briefly before delivering the next sentence. If such a freeze were implemented, he said, the president would need to explain the arithmetic to American drivers filling their tanks in Iowa, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. States where gasoline prices are not abstract policy discussions. They are political realities. That line landed heavily because it connected policy directly to voters, the most powerful pressure point in Democratic politics. Now, at this moment, listening to the address, something became clear. Carney was not merely defending Canada. He was strategically redirecting the consequences of Trump's threats back toward American domestic politics. And in trade conflicts, that kind of targeting changes the entire battlefield. Finally, Carney addressed the third threat. Trump had suggested withdrawing from the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. As Carney spoke, his legal team simultaneously released a detailed constitutional analysis explaining the actual withdrawal process. According to the agreement's own text and established legal precedent, exiting the trade pact requires 6 months formal notice and congressional involvement. It cannot be done instantly. It cannot be done through a social media post. And it cannot be executed by executive order alone. Carney allowed a faint smile to cross his face as he said something that quickly circulated through diplomatic circles around the world. He suggested that the president might wish to consult the text of the agreement he himself had signed. In that moment, the strategy behind the entire response became crystal clear. Numbers, legal structure, every piece of Trump's morning rhetoric had been answered with evidence. Because insults can be debated, threats can be shouted over. But spreadsheets are stubborn things. You cannot argue with arithmetic, and Carney had brought the spreadsheets. Still, what many viewers did not realize at that moment was that this statistical dismantling was only the first layer of Canada's response. Winning the argument was never the primary objective. The primary objective was pressure, and that pressure was about to begin. Because while Carney was speaking in Parliament, something else was already being activated behind the scenes. A series of economic measures so precisely targeted that they would begin reshaping the political landscape within hours. The speech was only the opening move. The real counterstrike was just beginning. As Mark Carney concluded the central portion of his address, many viewers believed the response had already reached its peak. The threats had been dismantled with data. The economic logic had been laid out clearly. Diplomats across Europe and Asia were already circulating excerpts of the speech. But what most people did not realize at that moment was that the speech itself was only the opening layer. The real pressure was about to arrive. At 12:45 p.m., while Carney was still speaking, the second phase of Canada's response quietly activated. These were not broad retaliatory tariffs that would hit entire industries on both sides of the border. That approach would have been loud but clumsy. Instead, Canada deployed something far more strategic: surgical economic countermeasures. Measures designed with the precision of a political campaign strategist who understands American electoral geography county by county. Each move was calculated to apply pressure exactly where it would generate the fastest political reaction. The first measure targeted agriculture. Canada announced the immediate suspension of potash export facilitation to 6 American agricultural states: Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Indiana, Missouri, and Ohio. To understand the impact of this decision, one must understand what potash actually represents. Potash is not a luxury commodity. It is one of the essential fertilizers required for modern industrial agriculture. Corn, soybeans, and wheat, the core crops that feed the United States and fuel its agricultural exports, depend heavily on potash application during planting season, and Canada controls roughly 30% of the global potash supply. The timing was not accidental. The suspension arrived precisely during the pre-planting window, the moment when fertilizer demand begins to surge as farmers prepare their fields for the upcoming growing cycle. At that stage, stockpiles are already allocated and alternative suppliers cannot easily replace large volumes on short notice. So when the announcement landed, commodity traders immediately understood the implication: supply uncertainty, higher input costs, lower projected yields. The 6 states chosen were not random either. Each of them sits in the American agricultural heartland. Each has strong Republican representation in Congress, and each contains farming communities whose livelihoods depend directly on fertilizer availability. Within hours, those farmers and the senators who represent them began asking urgent questions. Watching this unfold, it became obvious that Carney's team had studied the political map of the United States with extraordinary attention. This was not simply trade retaliation. This was political leverage applied with surgical accuracy. And that was only the first strike. The second measure targeted energy infrastructure. Canada issued formal notices to 3 major pipeline operators, indicating that capacity allocation reviews would soon begin. Under these reviews, priority would gradually shift toward Pacific and Atlantic export commitments rather than United States-bound shipments. This was not a dramatic shutdown. That is what made it powerful. Instead, it created operational uncertainty. American refineries across the Midwest and Gulf Coast depend heavily on Canadian crude. Their equipment was engineered specifically to process that grade of oil. Any disruption in long-term supply planning forces refinery managers into difficult decisions about sourcing, scheduling, and pricing. By initiating capacity reviews, Canada introduced a variable that refinery operators could not easily model. How much Canadian crude would still be available next quarter? How much would be redirected to global markets through new export terminals? Energy executives suddenly faced a planning environment filled with uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison to industrial supply chains. Then came the third measure. Canadian pension funds and institutional investors received accelerated guidance, encouraging continued diversification of sovereign risk exposure. In practical terms, this meant accelerating the movement of Canadian institutional capital away from concentrated holdings inside American markets. The scale of this capital was enormous. More than $400 billion in long-term investment funds, patient capital that anchors bond markets, stabilizes real estate valuations, and provides deep liquidity for equity markets. Instead of flowing primarily toward New York and other American financial centers, increasing portions of that capital would now be redirected toward London, Tokyo, Frankfurt, and Sydney. Again, the effect was not immediate collapse. The effect was gradual pressure. And financial markets are extremely sensitive to signals about long-term capital flows. Listening to analysts describe these measures throughout the afternoon, one observation kept repeating itself. Canada was not attempting to damage the American economy broadly. That would harm Canada as well. Instead, the strategy targeted specific political pressure points: agricultural states whose farmers influence Senate votes, energy infrastructure tied to refinery districts, financial markets that shape retirement accounts and investment portfolios across the country. This was retaliation calibrated down to the pound per square inch. The message was unmistakable. Canada knew exactly where American political pain could be generated, and the measures had been loaded in advance. But even this was not the final layer of the counterstrike. Because about 90 minutes after Carney's address began, something else happened that revealed just how far this preparation had extended beyond Canada's own borders. Statements began appearing from allied governments. The United Kingdom issued a message describing Canada's response as measured and responsible while characterizing the American provocation as counterproductive. Japan reaffirmed its strategic economic cooperation with Canada. The European Union emphasized that trade disputes between allies should be resolved through dialogue rather than threats. Australia followed with a statement highlighting its strategic partnership with Ottawa. Then South Korea expressed serious concern about unprovoked economic pressure against allied nations. 5 allied governments, 5 coordinated messages, all released within roughly 90 minutes. Anyone who has worked inside diplomacy understands how extraordinary that level of synchronization is. Governments do not issue coordinated statements across multiple continents on short notice unless those statements have already been drafted, approved, and scheduled in advance. This meant something profound. Carney's team had not simply prepared domestic countermeasures. They had quietly briefed allied capitals weeks earlier. They had secured agreement on language. They had arranged release timing. And when the trigger arrived that morning, the international coalition responded exactly as planned. What Trump believed would isolate Canada had instead isolated Washington. The president challenged one country. Within hours, 6 countries were publicly aligned against him. At that moment, geopolitical observers around the world began drawing the same conclusion. This confrontation had never been a spontaneous exchange. It had been an ambush waiting for a trigger. And Trump, reacting to a television interview early in the morning, had unknowingly provided that trigger right on schedule. But the most cutting evaluation of the entire episode would come later that afternoon from one of the most respected voices in global finance, Warren Buffett. And when Buffett spoke about what he had just witnessed, the lesson he delivered went far beyond a single political dispute. It became a lesson about leadership itself. Later that afternoon, as the political dust from the confrontation was still settling, one voice delivered a judgment that carried unusual weight. Warren Buffett, a man who has spent more than 70 years studying leadership, risk, and decision-making in the highest levels of global business, offered what may have been the most precise commentary of the entire episode. Buffett did not raise his voice. He did not engage in partisan rhetoric. Instead, he explained a principle that has guided every major investment decision he has made across 7 decades of evaluating companies, executives, and national economic environments. Preparation, he said, is the most reliable signal of competence. Before charisma, before confidence, before reputation, preparation. Buffett explained that whenever he watches a chief executive officer walk into an earnings call, he looks for one specific signal. Has the leader anticipated the difficult questions before they are asked? Have they modeled the scenarios, prepared the data, and considered the risks? When a leader demonstrates that level of preparation, Buffett said, it inspires confidence. When a leader improvises under pressure, filling gaps with bluster rather than substance, it signals something very different. And in Buffett's experience, markets are extraordinarily good at detecting that difference. Listening to his remarks, you could almost hear the deeper message forming beneath the surface. Because what had unfolded that day was not just a political confrontation between 2 governments. It was a live demonstration of 2 radically different leadership models. One leader reacted, the other anticipated, and the results were visible almost instantly in the most brutally honest arena that exists, financial markets. Buffett emphasized something that many people forget. Markets do not have political loyalties. They do not vote. They do not defend personalities or narratives. Markets simply price risk. And on that day, investors around the world were given 12 hours of uninterrupted data about the decision-making styles of 2 national leaders. The result appeared directly in the numbers before the closing bell. The Canadian dollar strengthened against the United States dollar, finishing the day higher despite an early morning drop triggered by Trump's initial threats. The currency began recovering almost exactly at the moment Carney started speaking at 12:30 p.m. By 3 p.m., the Canadian dollar was trading at its strongest level in roughly 6 weeks. Traders were not guessing. They were pricing competence. At the same time, American agricultural futures surged sharply in the 6 states affected by Canada's potash restrictions. Corn futures climbed as fertilizer supply uncertainty entered planting season projections. Soybean futures followed the same upward path, and wheat contracts rose across agricultural exchanges. Commodity traders were already modeling scenarios that included higher fertilizer costs, reduced planting efficiency, and potential yield pressure for the upcoming harvest. The shipments had not even stopped yet. But markets do not wait for physical shortages. Markets price expectations. And the expectation now included economic pain in the American heartland. Energy markets delivered their own verdict. Shares of refinery operators with heavy Canadian crude exposure companies such as Marathon Petroleum, Valero, and Phillips 66 declined as analysts began calculating the possible consequences of pipeline capacity reviews and shifting export priorities. Refineries built for Canadian heavy crude suddenly faced a future in which their most reliable supply might become uncertain. The assumption that Canadian oil would always flow south had been shaken, and investors reacted immediately. Financial sector stocks also softened as news spread about the accelerated diversification of Canadian institutional capital. That $400 billion investment pool represented long-term, stable funding for bond markets, real estate investments, and equity portfolios. When capital of that scale signals a gradual redirection toward London, Tokyo, Frankfurt, and Sydney, portfolio managers pay attention. The S&P 500 ended the day lower, with trade-sensitive industries leading the decline while defensive assets strengthened as investors sought stability. In other words, the markets had conducted their own silent referendum, and their verdict was unmistakable. The confrontation had hurt the United States more than Canada. But perhaps the most revealing development happened not on trading floors, but inside American politics. Within hours of Canada's countermeasures being announced, Republican senators from the 6 targeted agricultural states began contacting the White House. The language in their public statements was careful. Iowa senators issued a joint message calling for immediate dialogue to resolve agricultural supply disruptions. Nebraska's senator requested an emergency briefing from the Department of Agriculture regarding fertilizer alternatives. Ohio's senator, facing a difficult re-election campaign in 2026, demanded a full analysis of the trade implications of the morning's exchange. Behind those carefully chosen words was a simple reality. Farmers were already calling their offices. And when farmers begin asking questions during planting season, senators listen very closely. Kansas congressional representatives held emergency meetings with their state agricultural commissioner. Indiana's governor warned about potential instability in fertilizer supply chains. Missouri's senators quietly requested closed-door discussions with trade officials. Watching the situation unfold, the effectiveness of Canada's targeting became undeniable. Political pressure was rising exactly where it had been designed to rise. Not across the entire United States, but inside the districts that hold leverage over federal policy. By late afternoon, the White House had gone silent. The building that had dominated headlines at 7 a.m. with a burst of posts and televised threats suddenly stopped producing statements. No additional social media posts appeared. No press briefings were scheduled. Inside the administration, advisors were reportedly scrambling to assess which of the morning's promises were legally executable and which would cause severe economic damage if implemented. Think about the contrast for a moment. The morning had begun with noise. By evening, it ended with silence. And in diplomacy, silence after a provocation often signals something very specific. It signals a government realizing that commitments were made faster than they can be executed. Across global capitals, diplomats and policy analysts drew conclusions that extended far beyond the day's headlines. The speed, coordination, and discipline of Canada's response elevated its international standing dramatically. For years, Canada had been viewed as a middle power navigating around larger geopolitical players. Now, in the span of 12 hours, it had demonstrated strategic readiness, alliance coordination, and operational planning at a level many countries struggled to achieve. Meanwhile, the impulsive nature of the American provocation reinforced concerns that had already been circulating quietly among allied governments. Questions about reliability, questions about predictability, questions about whether policy decisions were being shaped through consultation or through emotional reaction. Every foreign ministry in the world had just witnessed a case study. One leader governed through impulse, reacting emotionally and broadcasting threats before consulting the experts responsible for implementing them. The other leader governed through preparation, activating a coordinated plan that had been war-gamed, reviewed, and aligned with international partners. And when those two approaches collided, the outcome followed a pattern that experienced strategists know very well. Preparation rarely loses to impulse. Buffett summarized the lesson with remarkable simplicity. Impulse starts fights. Preparation wins them. And the deeper question now facing Washington was not whether Mark Carney would be ready for the next confrontation. The real question was something far more unsettling. If another provocation comes tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., will Canada already have the next response package prepared, the allies briefed, the countermeasures loaded, and the timing calibrated? Based on what the world witnessed today, the answer appears painfully clear. Preparation is already waiting. Before we close, I want to hear your perspective. What do you think about this confrontation and the leadership styles we witnessed today? Share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like if this analysis helped you see the bigger picture, and subscribe so you never miss the next deep breakdown of global power and strategy.